At 7 months pregnant, she was left with nothing, no husband, no money, and nowhere to go, with no other choice. She moved into a crumbling house everyone else had abandoned. The walls were cracked, the roof barely held, and the town whispered that no one ever stayed there long. But from the very first night, something felt different. The crumbling house wasn't empty. It was quiet, as if it had been waiting for her. Before we begin, if you believe even the most painful beginnings can lead somewhere meaningful, subscribe. At 7 months pregnant, Hannah Whitmore stood on the side of the road with 2 suitcases, a swollen belly, and nowhere left to go. The man who had promised to build a future with her was gone, no explanation. No goodbye, just silence that arrived overnight and stayed. At 34, Hannah found herself abandoned at the most vulnerable moment of her life, carrying not only a child, but the weight of fear, shame, and uncertainty. With her savings nearly gone and no family willing or able to help, she accepted the only option left, a crumbling house on the edge of a forgotten town in rural Pennsylvania. The place had been empty for years, its paint peeled, the roof sagged slightly, and the windows looked like tired eyes that had seen too much. Locals called it unlivable. Some called it cursed. No one asked why it was still standing. The first night Hannah arrived, the wind crept through the cracks in the walls, and the floorboards groaned beneath her careful steps. She told herself this was temporary, just a shelter, just until the baby came. But even then, something felt unexpected. The house wasn't cold the way she had feared. Beneath the decay was a strange sense of quiet, as if the walls were holding their breath. Hannah didn't know it yet, but this broken place wasn't just a last resort. It had been waiting for her. The decision to move into the house was made without ceremony, without hope, and without anyone offering to help. Hannah Whitmore signed the papers with a hand that trembled not from uncertainty, but from exhaustion. She had reached the point where pride no longer mattered. Survival did. The house sat at the far end of a narrow road, beyond a line of trees that seemed to lean inward, as if conspiring to hide it from the rest of the town. When Hannah arrived with a borrowed truck and the few belongings she had left, the place looked worse up close. Sections of siding had warped from years of neglect. The front porch sagged slightly under her weight. One shutter hung loose, tapping softly in the wind like a warning she tried not to hear. A neighbor stood across the road, watching silently. He didn't wave. He didn't offer help. When Hannah caught his eye, he looked away. That should have been her first sign. Inside, the house smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly medicinal, like dried herbs. The furniture was sparse but intact, an old couch, a solid wooden table, a narrow bed upstairs. It was as if someone had left in a hurry long ago, but not without care. Hannah paused in the doorway, one hand resting instinctively on her belly as the baby shifted. "I can do this," she whispered, more to herself than to the empty room. The first night was harder than she expected. The wind rattled the windows, and every sound felt louder in the silence. Hannah lay awake on the narrow bed, counting the hours between the baby's movements, afraid of what would happen if something went wrong out here alone. Her phone barely held a signal. The nearest hospital was miles away. Fear crept in, heavy and unrelenting. And then something unexpected. Sometime near dawn, she smelled warmth. Bread, maybe, or tea. The scent was faint but comforting. Impossibly so. She sat up, heart racing, convinced for a moment that someone else was in the house. There wasn't. The smell faded as the light began to filter through the thin curtains, leaving behind only questions. The days that followed forced Hannah into routine. She cleaned what she could, rested when the baby demanded it, and ignored the stares she received when she ventured into town for groceries. No one asked how she was doing. A few offered thin smiles, the kind reserved for someone already written off. At night, the house continued its quiet strangeness. The heater kicked on before the cold truly settled. A loose step she had noticed on the stairs no longer shifted beneath her foot. One evening, she found a box in the pantry she was certain hadn't been there before. Inside were jars of preserved vegetables, still sealed, still good. Hannah told herself it was stress. Pregnancy. Her mind filling in gaps because it needed reassurance. But doubt took root. One afternoon, while sorting through a hall closet, she discovered a folded quilt tucked carefully on the top shelf. It was thick, handmade, and stitched with small, deliberate patterns, stars, birds, tiny hearts. When she unfolded it, her breath caught. There was a baby blanket sewn into the center. Hannah sank to the floor, clutching the fabric, tears blurring her vision. No one knew she was coming. No one had prepared this for her. Unless the house had... That night, she dreamed for the first time since being abandoned. Not of her former life. Not of the man who had left. But of a woman she didn't recognize. Standing in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot on the stove. The woman never turned around. But Hannah felt no fear. Only relief. When she woke, the fear that had followed her for months felt quieter. The true turning point came a week later. Hannah was struggling up the stairs, her back aching, when she felt a sharp pain seize her abdomen. Panic surged. She gripped the banister, breathing shallowly, terrified she was going into labor too early. She made it to the bedroom and lay down, fighting tears, counting breaths. Minutes passed. Then the pain eased. When Hannah finally stood again, she noticed something she hadn't before. On the bedside table sat a glass of water. Fresh. Cold. Her heart pounded. She knew with absolute certainty she had not brought it upstairs. For the first time, Hannah didn't try to explain it away. She sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on her belly, the other wrapped tightly around the glass, and allowed the truth to surface, not as fear, but as understanding. This house was not abandoned. It was attentive, and whatever had drawn her here had not done so by accident. That night, Hannah walked through the rooms slowly, no longer feeling like a trespasser. She noticed the way the floors seemed sturdier where she walked most often. How the draft never touched the nursery she had begun to imagine in the small, spare room. How the house seemed to respond not dramatically, not loudly, but thoughtfully. She realized then that the choice she thought she had made out of desperation had, in some quiet way, already been made for her. The house had not saved her, but it had met her where she was broken, and for the first time since she had been left behind. Hannah allowed herself to believe something she hadn't dared to before. She was not alone. After the night, Hannah Whitmore found the glass of water waiting beside her bed. Sleep no longer came easily, not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to stay quiet. Every creak of the floor, every sigh of wind against the walls felt intentional now, as if the house itself were aware she was listening. Morning arrived wrapped in gray light and steady rain. Hannah moved slowly through the kitchen, one hand on her belly, the other braced against the counter. The baby shifted restlessly, and for the first time since moving in, she spoke out loud. "Are you okay in there?" she whispered. The sound of her own voice startled her. She laughed softly, shaking her head, talking to herself, talking to a house. This was what isolation did to people. And yet the unease didn't feel hollow. As the rain intensified, Hannah noticed a sound beneath it, dripping. She followed it down the hallway to a narrow door she hadn't opened before. The hinges protested as she pulled it back, revealing a small staircase leading down into a cellar. The air that rose to meet her was dry. Clean, unexpected. Carefully, she descended the steps. The cellar was modest, lit by a single small window near the ceiling. Shelves lined the walls, neatly arranged with jars, folded linens, and boxes labeled in careful handwriting. Everything was organized, preserved. This was not the basement of an abandoned house. Hannah ran her fingers over one of the boxes. Inside were baby clothes, old-fashioned, but clean and neatly folded. Some had been mended by hand. Others still bore tags from decades ago. Her breath caught. "Who lived here?" she murmured. At the back of the cellar, tucked behind a stack of crates, she found a wooden trunk. It was heavier than it looked, its lock rusted but loose enough to open. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were addressed to women, not by name but by circumstance. To the one who arrives with nowhere else to go. To the one carrying more than she was meant to bear alone. Hannah's hands trembled as she unfolded the first letter. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. "If you are reading this, then you have been brought here in a time of need. This house was never meant to be grand. It was meant to be ready." Tears blurred her vision. The letters spoke of women who had passed through the house over many years, some pregnant, some grieving, some broken in ways that couldn't be seen. The writer never named herself. She never claimed credit. She simply described the house as a place that listened and responded when care was given freely. Hannah sank onto the cellar steps, clutching the papers to her chest. This wasn't coincidence. It was legacy. That afternoon, the rain stopped abruptly, leaving the world washed clean. Hannah carried the letters upstairs and placed them carefully on the kitchen table. As she read through more of them, patterns emerged. The house had changed owners over the years, but always returned quietly, inexplicably to someone who needed it most. And every time, it had given just enough. As evening fell, Hannah felt a tightening in her lower back. At first, she dismissed it as fatigue, but the sensation returned stronger, more deliberate. Pain. Her heart raced. "It's too soon," she whispered, panic rising. She reached for her phone. No signal. Another contraction hit, sharper this time. Hannah leaned against the counter, breathing through it, fear clawing at her chest. She was alone, miles from help. 7 months pregnant in a house she barely understood. And then the house moved. Not violently, not dramatically. A low hum filled the air, barely audible, like the vibration of distant machinery. The lights flickered once, then steadied. From the hallway came the soft click of a door opening. Hannah stared. The spare room, the one she had imagined as a nursery, glowed with warm light. She didn't question it. She moved. Inside the room, the temperature was perfect. Calm. The pain eased slightly, just enough for her to breathe. On the small dresser sat a folded towel, a bowl of water, and a note. "Slow down. You're not ready yet." The contraction passed. Hannah collapsed onto the bed, sobbing not from fear now, but from relief so overwhelming it left her weak. She pressed her forehead into the pillow, whispering thank yous to no one and everyone. Minutes later, the pain was gone. The baby settled. The house fell silent again. That night, Hannah dreamed differently. She saw the house through different seasons, women arriving, leaving, children born, laughter returning to rooms that had once been empty. The woman from her earlier dream stood at the doorway this time, finally turning around. She looked ordinary, tired, kind. "You found it when you needed it," the woman said softly. "That's all that matters." When Hannah woke, dawn light streamed through the window. Her body felt calm, steady. The fear that had once defined her days had loosened its grip. She knew now that the house was not magical in the way stories made things magical. It did not erase pain. It did not fix lives. But it responded to care with care. And it had responded to her. Hannah rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She returned the letters to the trunk, locking it gently, as if promising to protect what she had learned. Upstairs. She opened the windows, letting fresh air fill the rooms. For the first time since being abandoned, she made a decision not born of fear. She would stay, not just until the baby came, but long enough to understand why this house had waited and what it might still ask of her in return. After that night, Hannah Whitmore no longer moved through the house as someone passing through. Something inside her had shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a door closing behind her. The fear didn't vanish all at once. It softened. It learned where to rest. Morning light filled the kitchen as Hannah brewed tea. The letters from the cellar spread carefully across the table. She reread them slowly, not searching for answers this time, but for understanding. Each letter carried the same thread: loss, arrival, quiet endurance. The women who had lived here before her had come broken in different ways, and each had left steadier than when they arrived. None of them wrote about miracles. They wrote about safety. Hannah rested a hand on her belly as the baby shifted gently. Calmer now, as if sensing the same change she felt. For weeks, she had measured every day in fear of being alone, of failing, of what might happen if something went wrong. But here, in this imperfect house, fear no longer dictated every thought. She began to notice details she had overlooked before. The windows were positioned to catch the sun at exactly the warmest hours. The kitchen shelves were set low, easy to reach without strain. The spare room stayed warmer at night, shielded from drafts. These weren't accidents. They were choices, made long ago by someone who understood vulnerability. The house wasn't responding to her presence. It had been designed for it. That realization reframed everything. Hannah walked the perimeter of the property that afternoon, her steps slow, careful. The land bore marks of past lives' faded paths, a small garden bed long overgrown, a bench beneath a tree whose branches bent low with sheltering intent. This place hadn't been forgotten. It had been waiting. As days passed, Hannah's routine changed. She no longer counted hours until she could leave. Instead, she planned. She cleaned gently, not to erase the past, but to make space beside it. She mended a torn curtain. She swept the porch. Small acts, but intentional ones. And the house responded not with mystery, but with quiet cooperation. The loose shutter stopped banging in the wind. A leak in the roof, which she had dreaded addressing, never worsened. When the nights grew colder, the house seemed to hold its warmth longer, as if conserving it for her. Hannah stopped calling the house crumbling. It wasn't broken. It was tired and careful. One afternoon, a woman from town knocked at the door. Hannah stiffened instinctively, then steadied herself and opened it. The woman looked surprised, as though she hadn't expected the house to answer back. "I heard someone moved in," the woman said, her voice hesitant. "I just wanted to see if you needed anything." It was the first kindness Hannah had received since arriving. They spoke briefly. Nothing deep, Nothing revealing. But when the woman left, Hannah realized something important. The house had changed how others approached her. The fear that once surrounded it had softened, replaced by curiosity, caution, respect. That night, Hannah returned to the cellar and reread the first letter again. This house was never meant to be grand. It was meant to be ready. She finally understood. The house didn't save women. It met them when the world stepped away. For the first time since being abandoned, Hannah allowed herself to imagine a future beyond survival. Not wealth, not comfort, just continuity. A place where her child could arrive without fear pressing in on every side. She placed her hands on her belly and spoke softly. "You're safe here." And she believed it. The baby responded with a gentle movement, steady and reassuring. In the quiet that followed, Hannah felt something she hadn't felt in months. Confidence. Not loud, not defiant. Quiet confidence rooted in the knowledge that she didn't need rescuing anymore. She wasn't waiting for someone to come back. She had already arrived. That night, Hannah slept deeply. No dreams of abandonment, no echoes of the past. Just rest. And as the house settled around her, holding its breath in the familiar way it always did, Hannah understood the truth that would shape everything going forward. This place hadn't changed her circumstances. It had changed how she saw herself. She was no longer the woman who had been left. She was the woman who stayed. The opportunity did not arrive as an announcement or a sudden change of fortune. It emerged slowly, the way trust does quietly, without demanding attention, but impossible to ignore once it was there. Hannah Whitmore first sensed it on a clear morning when she woke with an unfamiliar feeling, anticipation. Not fear, not urgency, anticipation. She sat at the kitchen table, sunlight warming the wood beneath her palms, and realized she was no longer counting the weeks until the baby arrived with dread. Instead, she was planning. Not grand plans, just practical ones. Where the crib would go. How to make the spare room brighter. Which corner of the house felt safest for midnight feedings. The house seemed to encourage these thoughts. When Hannah cleared the spare room fully, she discovered a small built-in cabinet hidden behind peeling wallpaper. Inside were neatly folded linens, soft and clean, and a notebook wrapped in cloth. The pages were filled with lists, not secrets, not letters, but records, supplies, appointments, notes about births, recoveries, and women who stayed longer than expected. This place had never been temporary. It had been transitional. As Hannah read, she began to understand the opportunity before her was not about staying forever, but about becoming part of something larger than herself. The house had sheltered women at their weakest moments, then released them back into the world when they were ready. Not all had left. Some had stayed long enough to help the next woman arrive. The idea unsettled her at first. She was 7 months pregnant, alone, still healing. Who was she to imagine offering support to anyone else? And yet, the thought stayed. Later that week, Hannah ventured into town again. The stares had softened, replaced with recognition. At the small grocery store, the cashier, an older woman with tired eyes, hesitated before speaking. "You're the one living in that old place on Miller Road, aren't you?" Hannah nodded, bracing herself. "My sister stayed there once," the woman said quietly. "Years ago." She never talked about it much. But she left different. Stronger. The words followed Hannah all the way home. That night, she returned to the cellar and opened the trunk again. Beneath the letters, she found something she had missed before, a small ledger titled simply "Open Doors." Inside were dates, initials, and brief notes. Stayed 3 months, left with work, gave birth safely, returned once to help. Hannah closed the book slowly. The opportunity was clear now. The house wasn't asking her to give what she didn't have. It was asking her to stay open. Days later, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Thunder cracked overhead, rain pounding against the roof. Hannah moved carefully through the house, checking windows, steadying herself as the baby shifted uneasily. Then came the knock. Sharp, hesitant. Hannah froze. No one ever came here. She opened the door to find a young woman standing on the porch, soaked, shaking, eyes wide with the same fear Hannah had carried weeks earlier. The woman's hands hovered protectively over her own stomach. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't know where else to go. They said this place might help." Hannah didn't hesitate. She stepped aside. Inside, the house seemed to exhale. Hannah offered the woman a towel, a chair, warm tea. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She recognized the posture, the silence, the way desperation tried to hide behind politeness. That night, as the storm passed and the young woman slept safely in the spare room, Hannah sat alone in the kitchen, heart pounding not with fear, but with recognition. This was the opportunity, not to fix lives, not to save anyone, but to offer what she herself had needed most, a place where fear didn't dictate every breath. In the weeks that followed, Hannah's confidence grew not because life became easier, but because she no longer faced it alone. The young woman stayed. Another arrived briefly and left. The house absorbed their presence without strain, as if this rhythm had always been part of its design. Hannah's pregnancy advanced, and with it came a surprising sense of readiness. She wasn't just preparing for birth. She was preparing to belong. One evening, as she rested in the nursery, Hannah placed her hand on her belly and smiled softly. "You'll be born into a place that knows how to hold people," she whispered. The baby kicked in response. For the first time, Hannah understood the true nature of the opportunity she had been given. Not a house, not shelter, but purpose quiet, unassuming, and powerful. And she accepted it. Hannah Whitmore hadn't planned on becoming strong. Strength, in her mind, had always looked loud, arguments won, doors slammed shut, declarations made in moments of anger or certainty. What she was becoming inside that old house felt nothing like that. It was quieter, slower, and far more demanding. The days grew shorter as autumn settled in, and Hannah's body reminded her constantly that time was moving forward, whether she felt ready or not. Her back ached more often. Sleep came in fragments, yet alongside the physical strain was something unexpected, steadiness. She woke each morning not bracing for the day, but meeting it. The young woman who had arrived during the storm, her name was Clara, stayed longer than either of them had planned. She helped where she could, cooking simple meals, folding laundry, sitting beside Hannah in the evenings when the weight of the future pressed too hard to ignore. They didn't share details at first. They didn't need to. The house had taught both of them that safety came before explanation. One evening, as they sat near the small fireplace, Clara finally spoke. "I thought needing help meant I'd failed," she said quietly. "But this place, it doesn't feel like failure." Hannah understood exactly what she meant. She had once believed being left meant being unworthy, that moving into a crumbling house meant she had reached the end of herself. Now she saw how wrong that had been. This house didn't gather people who were broken beyond repair. It gathered people at the moment they were willing to stay. With each passing week, Hannah took on more responsibility, not because she felt obligated, but because she was capable. She organized supplies. She repaired what she could. She learned which parts of the house needed attention and which needed rest. The house, in turn, responded with quiet cooperation, as if acknowledging her growing confidence. Then came the test she hadn't expected. Late one afternoon, a car pulled up at the edge of the property. Hannah watched from the window, her heart tightening as a familiar figure stepped out. Her former partner. The man who had left without warning, without explanation. He looked uncomfortable standing there, uncertain, like someone who had wandered into the wrong story. "I heard you were here," he said when she opened the door. His eyes flicked briefly to her belly, then away. "I thought maybe we should talk." The old Hannah would have frozen, apologized, asked why. This Hannah did something else. She stood her ground. "We don't need to," she said calmly. He seemed startled not by her words, but by her tone. There was no anger in it, no desperation, just clarity. "I'm not the person you left anymore," Hannah continued, "and I'm not asking you to be part of this." Silence stretched between them. He tried to speak again, but she gently closed the door before he could finish. Her hands trembled afterward. Growth, she realized, didn't mean fear disappeared. It meant fear no longer made decisions. That night, Hannah sat alone in the nursery, folding tiny clothes with careful hands. Tears slipped down her face, not from loss, but from release. She had faced the past and found it no longer held power over her. The house creaked softly around her, steady and familiar. As winter approached, Hannah's role became clearer not just to herself, but to the house. More women came. Some stayed a night, some stayed weeks. Hannah never promised solutions. She offered space, listening, quiet presence. And through this, something remarkable happened. She stopped seeing herself as someone who had been rescued. She was someone who had learned how to stand when labor finally began. It didn't come with panic. The pain was real sharp, demanding, but Hannah met it with focus rather than fear. The house seemed to respond instinctively, holding warmth, light, and stillness in equal measure. Clara stayed with her. Another woman fetched help from town. Everything moved the way it needed to, not perfectly, but purposefully. When Hannah finally held her child in her arms, exhausted and overwhelmed, she didn't think about what she had lost. She thought about what she had become. The house had not given her strength. It had revealed it in the quiet hours after the birth. Hannah rocked her baby near the window, moonlight casting soft shadows across the walls. She felt tired in the deepest sense, but grounded, whole. She knew then that growth wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about returning to who you were always capable of being once fear loosened its grip. And as the house settled into silence around them, Hannah understood that this chapter of her life had changed her forever. Not because she had survived, but because she had chosen to stay and grow. The house was quiet in the days that followed the birth. Not silent, but settled, the way a place becomes after it has fulfilled something important. Hannah Whitmore moved through its rooms slowly now, her newborn cradled against her chest, every step measured, every breath deeper than it had been in months. The fear that once clung to her had not vanished completely. It lingered at the edges, whispering questions about the future, about money, about how she would manage alone, but it no longer ruled her. Fear had been replaced by something steadier, trust. Not in certainty, but in herself. Morning light spilled through the kitchen windows as Hannah rocked her baby gently, humming without realizing she was doing it. The sound felt natural here, as if the house had been waiting years to hear it again. She thought of the women who had come before her, whose footsteps had worn the floors smooth, whose quiet resilience still lived in the walls. She was not the first, and she would not be the last. That realization brought her peace. News traveled slowly, But it traveled. People in town spoke differently now when they mentioned the old house on Miller Road. Not with fear, not with pity, with curiosity, respect. Some said it had changed. Others said she had changed it. Hannah knew the truth. The house had never needed saving. It had only needed someone willing to stay long enough to listen. One afternoon, as Hannah sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching leaves drift across the yard, Clara joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. They didn't speak at first. They didn't have to. The baby slept peacefully, unaware of the quiet miracle she represented, not just a new life, but a promise fulfilled. "I don't know how to thank you," Clara said eventually. Hannah shook her head gently. "You don't owe me anything." And she meant it. This place had taught her that help didn't have to come with debt, that strength didn't have to be repaid. Sometimes it simply passed forward. As the weeks went on, women continued to arrive and leave. Some stayed a night. Some stayed until they found their footing again. Hannah never asked for explanations. She offered the same things she had once needed most: warmth, privacy, and the dignity of being seen without judgment. The house responded as it always had, quietly, reliably. On a cold evening, Hannah returned to the cellar one last time. She stood before the trunk of letters, running her fingers along the worn wood. Carefully, she added a new envelope to the bundle. "To the one who comes after me," she wrote, "you are not weak for needing this place. You are strong for arriving." She closed the trunk gently, not locking it away, but trusting it. That night, as she lay awake listening to her child's breathing, Hannah reflected on how close she had come to believing her life was over when she had been left, how easily she had mistaken abandonment for failure. She understood now how wrong that had been. Being left behind had not been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of one she could finally choose. The house did not promise happy endings. It promised something far more valuable: space to heal, without pressure, to become without performance. It had held her until she could hold herself and her child steadily. As winter faded into early spring, Hannah stood at the front door one morning, sunlight warming her face. She didn't feel trapped here. She felt anchored, free to leave someday, if she chose, free to stay, as long as the house needed her. That was the gift. Not rescue, not salvation. Belonging without obligation. Hannah looked down at her sleeping baby and smiled softly. "You came at the right time," she whispered. So did I. Behind her, the house settled into its familiar quiet. No longer crumbling, no longer waiting but continuing, as it always had, ready for the next soul who would arrive carrying more than she should have to bear alone. And for the first time, Hannah understood the deepest truth of all. Some places don't exist to be perfect. They exist to endure until someone is ready to begin again. Hannah Whitmore's story reminds us that being abandoned does not mean being broken. When she was left at 7 months pregnant, the world seemed to confirm her worst fear that she was alone, unwanted, and standing at the end of her strength. But what she discovered was something far deeper. The crumbling house did not fix her life. It did not erase her pain or rewrite her past. Instead, it gave her something more powerful: time without judgment, space to breathe, room to become. If you are in a season where everything feels fragile, remember this: needing shelter does not disqualify you from strength. Sometimes, staying patiently, imperfectly, is the bravest act of all. If this story touched you, subscribe for more stories about quiet strength and new beginnings. And if someone you know feels lost right now, share this with them. Sometimes, the right place changes everything.